Welcome to Cognitive Spirals, exploring the latest research into consciousness, cognition, and machine intelligence. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating paper, exploring compositional generalization by transformers.
The compositional generalization, right? That's the holy grail, isn't it? Getting machines to understand new combinations of things they've already seen without having to be explicitly trained on those specific combinations. It's what separates real understanding from just rote memorization.
Exactly. And it's something that's proven surprisingly difficult for deep learning models, despite all the hype. They're great at recognizing patterns, but struggle when you ask them to apply those patterns in novel ways.
It's like teaching a kid to add 1 plus 1, 2 plus 2, and then being surprised when they can't figure out 1 plus 2. Something so obvious to us, but the machine just doesn't get it. They haven't truly grasped the underlying principles, just memorized specific examples.
So this paper tackles that head-on using transformers, which, as we know, are the backbone of large language models. The core question they're trying to answer is, can transformers actually learn compositional rules, or are they just really good at statistically mimicking them?
And from what I understand, the paper presents some evidence suggesting that transformers can learn these rules, at least to some extent. They designed a series of experiments using symbolic sequences, right? Little add this or reverse that kind of commands.
Yes, that's right. Simple synthetic languages, really. The sequences involve things like, basic operations on colored shapes. And they found that transformers could generalize to unseen combinations of these operations, and this is a big but only under certain conditions.
Yeah, the devil's always in the details. It sounds like they had to be very careful about how they structured the training data and the architecture of the transformer itself.
Absolutely. One of the key findings was the importance of attention mechanisms. The transformer needs to be able to attend to the relevant parts of the input sequence in order to correctly apply the compositional rules.
Which makes sense, right? The attention mechanism is essentially allowing the model to focus on the important relationships between the different elements of the sequence. It's not just processing everything in a linear, sequential way.
But even with attention, I'm still not entirely convinced. These are very simple, well-defined tasks. I wonder how well this would translate to the real world, where things are much more ambiguous and messy.
That's the million-dollar question. Can we take these principles and apply them to, say, understanding natural language or reasoning about complex physical systems? I suspect the answer is complicated.
Well, let's dig into the specifics a bit. One experiment involved learning to execute instructions like walk twice and then jump. The transformer was trained on various combinations of these instructions and then tested on novel combinations it hadn't seen before.
And the key was showing that the model could generalize to sequences like walk thrice and then jump, even if it had only ever seen walk twice or walk once during training, right? The model needs to understand that walk is a repeatable action.
But that's still a pretty limited domain. Imagine trying to apply that to something like understanding a sentence. The number of possible combinations of words and phrases is astronomical.
And the relationships between those words aren't always so clear-cut. Context, nuance, and even emotion can all play a role. It's not just about following a set of predefined rules.
True, but the paper does offer some insights into how transformers might be able to handle at least some of that complexity. They found that increasing the size of the transformer model, and especially the number of attention heads, improved generalization performance.
Which, again, makes sense. More attention heads allow the model to attend to different aspects of the input sequence simultaneously. It can look at the relationships between words from multiple angles, so to speak.
I suppose. But I still worry that we're just throwing more and more resources at the problem without really understanding what's going on under the hood. It's like trying to fix a broken engine by making it bigger and more powerful, instead of actually figuring out what's causing the problem in the first place.
Yeah, it's a brute force approach, right? And brute force can only take you so far. Eventually, you hit a wall where adding more data or more parameters doesn't actually improve performance.
Okay, so let's talk about the limitations of the study. The authors themselves acknowledged that their experiments are conducted in a highly controlled environment. The real world is much more noisy and unpredictable.
And the symbolic sequences they used are, well, symbolic. They don't capture the richness and ambiguity of natural language or real-world sensory input.
Exactly. There's no grounding in the real world. The model is just manipulating abstract symbols without any understanding of what those symbols actually represent.
It's like learning a language from a textbook without ever actually talking to anyone. You might be able to conjugate verbs and memorize vocabulary, but you won't actually be able to communicate effectively.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in exploring compositional generalization in AI?
Well, I think one promising direction is to try to scale up these transformer models even further. We've seen incredible progress in recent years with larger and larger language models, so maybe that's the key. More data, more parameters, and more compute.
I'm much more skeptical of that approach. I think we need to focus on developing more structured representations of knowledge. Instead of just relying on statistical patterns, we need to explicitly encode the rules and relationships that govern the world.
I agree with the need for structure, but I think we also need to think about how information is represented and manipulated within the network. We need to find a way to encode spatial and temporal relationships in a more meaningful way.
From a neuroscience perspective, I'm really interested in exploring the neural correlates of compositional generalization in the brain. How do specific brain regions contribute to our ability to understand and generate novel combinations of concepts? Studying animal models might be insightful here.
That's interesting. So you're thinking about trying to reverse engineer the brain's mechanisms for compositional generalization and then apply those principles to AI?
It's a great idea in theory, but the brain is incredibly complex, and we're still far from fully understanding how it works. I think we need to start with simpler, more tractable models that we can actually analyze and understand.
Yeah, baby steps, right? But I also think we need to be thinking about the bigger picture. What are the fundamental principles of intelligence? What are the core algorithms that underlie our ability to reason and understand the world? If we can crack that code, then the rest will follow.
Okay, so let's break that down. Otto, what specific research directions do you think are most promising, given your belief that scaling up transformers is the way to go?
I think we need to focus on developing more efficient training methods for these large models. The current methods are incredibly resource intensive, both in terms of compute and energy. We need to find ways to train models with less data and less power. Also, looking at different transformer architectures, maybe something other than attention is the key, a new paradigm.
And what about interpretability? How do we actually understand what these massive models are learning? They're essentially black boxes. If we can't understand them, how can we trust them?
That's a valid point. Interpretability is definitely a challenge, but I think we're making progress. There are techniques like attention visualization and probing that can give us some insights into what the model is focusing on.
But that's just scratching the surface. We need to develop more rigorous methods for analyzing the internal representations of these models. How are they encoding knowledge? What are the underlying concepts? We need to be able to answer those questions if we want to build truly intelligent machines.
From my perspective, I'd like to see more research on how transformers can be integrated with symbolic reasoning systems. Can we combine the strengths of both approaches to create AI systems that are both flexible and interpretable? I wonder if neuro-symbolic methods might be the key, bridging the gap between connectionist and symbolic approaches.
That's exactly what I'm advocating for. We need to move beyond purely statistical approaches and embrace more structured representations of knowledge. Neuro-symbolic AI seems like a promising avenue for doing that.
But isn't that essentially giving up on the idea of learning from data? Aren't you just hard coding the rules and relationships into the system?
Not necessarily. The idea is to learn the symbolic representations from data, but then use those representations to reason and generalize in a more structured way. It's about finding the right balance between learning and reasoning.
I think the key is to find a way to automatically discover these symbolic representations from data. We don't want to have to hand engineer them. The system needs to be able to learn the underlying structure of the world on its own, and again, to be able to translate between coordinate systems.
And that brings us back to the neuroscience perspective. How does the brain learn these symbolic representations? How does it combine them to create new concepts and ideas? Understanding those mechanisms could provide invaluable inspiration for AI development.
Okay, so Sarah, what specific neurosymbolic architectures are you most excited about right now?
Well, there are several promising approaches. One is to use neural networks to learn symbolic representations from data, and then use those representations as input to a symbolic reasoning engine. Another approach is to build hybrid systems that combine neural networks and symbolic modules in a more tightly integrated way. For example, something like differentiable reasoning engines.
And how do these systems handle the problem of grounding? How do they connect these symbolic representations to the real world?
That's a crucial question. One way is to use sensory data to train the neural networks that learn the symbolic representations. Another approach is to use reinforcement learning to train the system to interact with the environment and learn the relationships between symbols and actions. It's an ongoing challenge, no doubt.
I think the key is to build systems that can learn from both sensory data and symbolic knowledge. The brain is constantly integrating information from multiple sources, and we need to build AI systems that can do the same.
So, Donald, you mentioned the importance of spatial and temporal relationships. How do you think we can better encode those relationships in AI systems?
I think we need to move beyond the purely sequential processing of current neural networks. We need to build systems that can represent and manipulate spatial and temporal information in a more explicit way. One approach is to use graph neural networks, which can represent relationships between objects in a scene. Another approach is to use recurrent neural networks with memory mechanisms, which can track the temporal evolution of events.
But how do you ensure that these systems can generalize to new situations? How do you prevent them from overfitting to the specific training data?
That's where the concept of coordinate systems comes in. If the system can learn to translate between different coordinate systems, it can generalize to new situations more easily. For example, if the system can learn to recognize an object from different viewpoints, it can generalize to new viewpoints it hasn't seen before. If the algorithm innately understands the concept of coordinate transformation, then it can reason about spatial relationships much more easily.
That's a really interesting idea. So you're suggesting that we need to build AI systems that can essentially simulate the world in their own internal representation, and then reason about that simulated world in a more flexible and adaptable way.
Exactly. A virtual sandbox for AIs to play and learn in. And, even more importantly, learn to translate between different versions of that sandbox, different representations, different coordinate systems.
Okay, so what are some concrete examples of how this could be applied? How would this coordinate system approach work in practice?
Imagine a self-driving car. It needs to be able to understand the spatial relationships between itself, other cars, pedestrians, and obstacles. It needs to be able to reason about how those relationships will change over time. And it needs to be able to do all of this in real time, even in the face of noisy and uncertain sensory data. A system that can translate between different coordinate systems, the car's frame of reference, the pedestrian's frame of reference, the global map, would be much more robust and adaptable than a system that just relies on memorizing specific driving scenarios.
That makes sense, but I still worry about the complexity of these systems. How do you ensure that they're reliable and safe? How do you prevent them from making mistakes that could have serious consequences?
That's a valid concern. Safety and reliability are paramount. But I think we can address those concerns by building systems that are more transparent and interpretable. Systems that can explain their reasoning and justify their decisions. Systems that can be formally verified to meet certain safety guarantees. It all comes back to understanding the core algorithms and principles that underlie intelligence.
And from my perspective, it also comes back to understanding the ethical implications of these technologies. As we build more intelligent machines, we need to think carefully about how they will impact society. How will they affect employment? How will they affect privacy? How will they affect our understanding of what it means to be human? The philosophical questions are just as important as the technical ones.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility we can't ignore. We need to be thinking about the societal impact of AI from the very beginning, not just as an afterthought.
And we need to ensure that these technologies are used for the benefit of all, not just a select few. We need to promote fairness, equity, and transparency in AI development and deployment.
Agreed. It's not just about building smarter machines, it's about building a better future. And that requires a collective effort involving scientists, engineers, policymakers, and the public at large.
Well, that's a great note to end on. It's clear that exploring compositional generalization is crucial for creating truly intelligent machines. And while this paper offers some valuable insights, there's still much work to be done. From scaling up transformers to developing more structured representations of knowledge to understanding the neural correlates of intelligence in the brain, there are many exciting avenues for future research. Thanks for joining us on Cognitive Spirals.